Our final presenter is Cole Humphrey. Cole is a forester for Hearst Forests in McLeod, California. A Siskiyou County native, he split his time growing up between the Shasta and Scott valleys. Cole holds a BS in forestry with an emphasis in forest operations from Humboldt State University. Wasting no time, he graduated in 2016 on a Saturday and started his professional career the very next Monday with Michigan California Timber Company in Wairika. At MCTC, Cole began as a technician and quickly advanced into plan writing and earned his registered professional forester's license in 2020. By the end of 2021, he was promoted to inventory forester, a role he held until the company's timberlands were sold in 2022. Following the sale, Cole transitions to FWS Forestry, where he helped manage Acer Klamath Timberlands until 2023. Since then, he has been with Hearst Forests, where he helps manage 82,000 acres of timberlands. Cole considers himself a generalist forester, but his true passions lie in forest inventory and forest planning. Please help me join in welcoming Cole Humphrey.
Thanks, Molly. I think this is going to cue really well behind Dave. We're going to kind of keep going off the same topics. So yeah, we're going to be discussing even age forest management and impacts on species composition, stand health, and resiliency, particularly with how timber production focus on even age management with like single tree selection relates to forest resiliency.
Kind of tricky. You have to. Can someone show you the buttons?
Okay, so yeah, my background is entirely in private industrial timberlands. So I just want to caveat with that, but I'm going to try to incorporate a lot of the recent ecological silviculture science that's been coming from the Pacific Southwest Research Station, Redding, and research that Ryan Tompkins worked on with UC Extension and Rob York down in Blodgett, down in Camino. So the goals are, we're just going to define what like a resilient forest is in Northern California and how that compares to structures we see in timber production focused stands nowadays. And then also kind of want to compare how historic conditions and how it's changed into conditions we see today. So it's kind of incorporating the same thing, but concepts, structural components, past conditions, changing conditions, current conditions, and then some comments that I want to talk about at the end, moving forward. But the main thing we'll see throughout the whole discussion is what is the structure in these forests with the different species, densities, and then how different disturbances influence these structures, and then how does this look over the geographic scale, and then also how it changes over time. So we're going to define a resilient forest as the capacity or resiliency as the capacity of a system to absorb disturbances and reorganize while undergoing change. So still retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedback. So the main thing is if a disturbance occurs, even if there's some structural shifts, the eco services that we'll say like montane forests are providing stay the same. We're retaining vegetation cover, we're providing wildlife habitat, retaining soil. And we'll see like in historic conditions, what are elements that create resiliency. That's generally certain tree species like yellow pine and white pine, sugar pine, ponderosa, Douglas fir, and to a certain capacity cedar. And then tree size, generally large trees, they have thicker bark, deeper root systems, they can handle disturbance a lot better. And then the configuration, there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of heterogeneity. And we'll see, especially generally just since they're larger trees, it's generally more well spaced out. And then how does this compare to timber production on management? So the photo on the right, this is in Idaho. This is in the Soay Bitterroot wilderness. See, this system hasn't seen that much fire exclusion. So we see that larger tree component well spacing. The photo on the left is, this is actually, it's on Hearst Forest. This is timberland that's managed for timber production. And so we're going to define uneven structure as the compact, sorry. As uneven age management involves the manipulation of forested stands for continuous high forest cover, recurring regeneration of desirable species, and orderly growth and development of trees through a range of age classes provide sustained yield of forest products. And particularly with private forests in California, they're mandated or they're regulated under the California Forest Practice Act. And the first thing it states with timberlands that are regulated by that act, the goal of maximum sustained production of high quality timber products is achieved while giving consideration to and a list of bunch of other values. But note that the first thing it mentions is timber production. So in private timberlands, we're slightly mandated to focus on timber production. And so we have different goals of stocking to maintain. So we're going to kind of break down that definition of different elements that go into uneven age forest structures. So the first thing it notes is continuous high forest cover. And essentially what that is referencing is density. And so density is a measurement of occupancy of the site. And foresters end up categorizing that density, and we call it stocking. And essentially what we're relating to is how much of the site is using its growth potential. And so let's take a football field, for example. If we planted one tree, which a football field is about an acre. If we planted one tree out there, that tree would be growing its full capacity, but the site isn't being fully used. And so foresters generally are trying to optimize that and maximize the growth out of it. So we need ways to measure that. And so there's absolute measurements, direct measurements. So just like trees per acre or base layer, how much wood is applied over an acre is ways to measure it. But there's a lot of inconsistency and doesn't really truly show the variation we see in forest structures. So let's take that football field, 1 acre, and we want 100 feet of basal area on that stand. That can be made up by 20, 30-inch trees, or it could be made up by 93, 14-inch trees. And so if we like contextualize like in a 3D environment, the canopy of those smaller trees is probably taking up a larger area. So that's kind of the variation we see in density. And so there's ways to normalize how we look at forest, and those are relative measurements. And I'm not going to go to math of like stand density index and whatnot, but the main things are we're going to use relative density a couple times. And it's a scale of 0 to 100 of site being understocked to site being fully stocked. So the higher the number, the more dense the stand is. The other thing it notes is a range of age classes. So why do we need a range of age classes and uneven age stands? Because that's where we're getting a regeneration. We need continuous regeneration coming in since we're not planting it. And so if you're limited to less than 3 age classes within a stand, after a time of going in and selecting trees, you'll eventually run out of trees over time, right? And so how foresters explain that distribution is they do a diameter class distribution over trees per acre. And the main thing is just to keep even harvest over time. You need a lot of regeneration, a lot of small trees, and that wanes to larger trees in your upper cohort. So comparatively to other stand structures, like a plantation and even age, the diameters are generally one size. So the x-axis is diameter classes, so 2-inch, 4-inch, 6-inch, so on. And the y-axis is trees per acre. So in a plantation, you'll get this, it's called the bell curve condition. And on an even age, it ends up being this J curve, smaller trees waning to fewer larger trees. Comparatively though, I want to also know that with like stored and irregular structures, which is, we'll see is probably what was more common in historic legacy conditions. You see there's already heterogeneity in there. And even though there's kind of heterogeneity in uneven age, it's really gradual. So it's really continuous ladder fuels for fire to move into the canopy. And then finally, since we're keeping stands relatively dense and with multiple age classes, because we're always having that regeneration. And eventually, well, especially in mixed conifer stands in California, it'll generally lead to shade tolerant species becoming more prevalent. And this in our area is generally white fir and incense cedar. And they're able to come in because they have such large surface area of needle cast to capture a little bit of light that's left in the understory. And the issue with these species, especially with white fir, is it generally has thin bark even when it gets older. It's really susceptible to a lot of disease. It's easily impacted by drought because it has a really shallow root system. So this is what happens generally with kind of uneven age management over a long period of times on like wetter sites. So here's a pine plantation off of Highway 89. This was planted in the mid-70s, and even without a real seed source, the cedar white fir understory came in heavily with higher canopies. It's just been thin, but so actually there used to be way more than even this photo shows. So kind of summarizing, this is what we're getting at. We want this like multi-age stand that's relatively dense. This is kind of an ideal situation, or this is ideal for timber production, right? And so looking at it more quantitatively, I made some inventory numbers up for that photo, just try to, so people can see it. But so we have that J curve, the different colors relate to different species, and the density ends up being 75. So 75 out of 100, the stand is relatively dense and it's ready for selection or thinning. And you also see when we correlate the basal area to the different age classes, you can really see clearly those different cohorts of age classes. So let's compare that to historic conditions. So as it's been mentioned multiple times, there was just a high amount of frequent low intensity fire. The photo on top right is up in the Plumas National Border, up in Plumas County, I believe. And I think it's in 1911. You can see how open it is. And due to that frequent fire return interval, it basically consolidated biomass into these larger pines. There's a little understory vegetation. And this map on the bottom right is just fire history from 1879 to 1970. And this is actually still even mapping the more moderate to high intensity fires. You can still see they're generally smaller, but it's not even mapping all the low intensity fires because they were so low, they generally weren't even, you can't even like, use dendrochronology to map them. John Lieber, Forest Service employee who was doing a stand inventory of Northern Sierras, noted suppression of gum growth has always been one of the serious results of fires. The land does not carry more than 35% of the quantity of timber it is capable of supporting. So even then, a forester is like mentioning how the natural landscape doesn't necessarily meaning its timber production threshold, but it's sitting low, and obviously they showed up and they're still forest, that's resilient. So there's been looking at historic inventory data. This is in Western Plumas County, what is modern, a lot of Collins Pines timberlands. They did an inventory. You can see the photos. It's generally large pine with this white fir, Douglas fir understory component. The main thing is noted in the historic in 1924, the conifers that were over 10 inches were found to be about 18 trees per acre. And by 2011, it's increased to 65 trees per acre. And the graph on the top right, the orange is referencing pine, and then blue is white fir. And so the top right is historical conditions in 1911. You see there's a much larger percentage of pine in the stands, and it's over time switched over to white fir. This is another study that was conducted in Central Sierra and Southern Sierra, and we're just going to focus on the far left graph. And so it's a distribution table as well. And the red is pine. You can see that predominantly in 1924 or 1911, predominantly there were larger pines in the stand, and the graph below it is 2011 inventory. You can see tree diameters have shifted to the left, they're getting smaller. Then this graph on the right is a bubble graph, which essentially is showing it's the y-axis is that relative density 0 to 100. 1911, we can see there's generally lower densities, and then in 2011, densities are higher. There's also a lot more variance in our standing conditions. And then also note when you get towards the top to 100, means that there's gonna be imminent mortality in the stand. It's about to start to fall apart, and you can see there's a lot more stands that are closer to that point. It's like kind of what David was mentioning with that Douglas fir stand. That's starting to happen all over California. So what happened? Why did these structures change? As mentioned, fire exclusion, 1910, the big burn in Montana, Forest Service starts to have a really, aggressive stance towards fire suppression, the 10 a.m. policy, getting a fire out, by the next day at 10 a.m. But also remember that the stands were way less dense. It's also a lot easier to control these initial fires. And then we'll go into by the mid 20th century, so silviculture practices would end up being high grading. This is a photo of Mount Shasta, I think this is in the 50s. The background, the mid slope in the background, you can see how open it is. And I don't think it's from fire exclusion, I think that's from water at the sea. So, and that was high grade selective cutting, or cutting from above, predominantly cutting the larger trees out of the stands. And what have we seen in those historical photos? Those are predominantly pine, the more resilient trees in the stands. Take our example, J-curve stand. This is just trying to apply it really quickly. Just cut all the 24-inch trees out of it. And even this, the program I use for this, it pretty equally distribute the species. It's still new to give white fir an understory, and there's actually a lower change or delta in the white fir population. So you can already see, like, even in this like really simplified model, it's still, there's a larger proportion of white fir, the residual stand. Rob York did a study on this for shelter wood removals down in Blodgett, and you see similar things. So it's the bottom left graph, the right column. It's a change in residual species percentage in the stand. So after harvesting generally the larger trees out of the stand, we see an increase in white fir, and when we see a decrease in Douglas fir and pine. And also in the later 20th century, there's just a lot of changes in regulatory objectives. There's a lot more focus on clean water and endangered species, which is great. Another big shift that isn't talked about enough is the change in how California on private lands taxes timberlands. So prior to 1976, California had an ad valorem tax, which means you were taxed on your standing inventory. So that incentivizes landowners to cut their properties really hard. So after 1976, we have our modern yield tax system. So that's when timberlands are zoned for timber production zone. They have a relatively low property tax, and then you're taxed for your yield. So what does this end up happening with, especially on water quality and with endangered species? Those resources are really related to higher canopy cover. So we're still continually increasing forest types, and since we were high grading and generally reducing the more resilient species out of it, we have gradually made our stands less resilient. And the other thing to note, there's also people cut out different cohorts in their stands. So even when you're trying to apply single tree selection on image management, sometimes you don't even have the cohorts there. You're just kind of forcing, like a square peg into a round hole. So I just want to go over some different stand conditions you see around here. This is a stand that was probably they cut the Douglas fir off the top of it, and there was a white fir Douglas fir understory component, and it's been left probably since the 70s, hasn't been touched since then. And so essentially it all came up together, and essentially it's formed a plantation, even though it was a natural stand. And we can see the density is off the charts. It broke the scale. And you could, when you go in the stand, there's a lot of mortality and whatnot in it. So things that we can do to increase resiliency and also try to incorporate timber production into it is we can do a thinning from below, which will increase the average diameter class. Then you probably need to wait 10 or 15 years, and then you can either do some like really intensive variable thinning, so create some gaps and skips, or we could cut in small groups to get different cohorts to come into it and increase heterogeneity in the stand. This is a stand that I don't know how intensely high graded it was in the past, but it's seen single tree selection probably 4 times since the 80s. And essentially has come out to be 2 different cohorts. There's this dogwood understory, and then it's white fir in the overstory. And it's probably a similar thing where we just need to either create gaps or do this really non-systematic thinning in it. But the issue is like for production side, there is no conifer regeneration. And then for resiliency status, like there's continuous fuels in the understory that could go into the crown. So this stand is on the Forest Service just south of Mount Shasta. And it's actually kind of similar to that first stand we looked at, but it's seen that initial thinning. And so it's, it's increased the canopy height off the floor, so there's less likely to get a crown fire, and they've left the largest trees. But for a timber production viewpoint, there's no regeneration coming in. So the same thing, if you keep harvesting single trees out of it, eventually run out of trees. So we need to do some things to think about how to bring production back into the fold. This is on Hearst Forest. Seeing multiple selections, and for like a resiliency standpoint, it looks great. Like it probably could handle different amount, different intensities of fire or drought. But again, for timber production, it's not ideal. Once you cut out that white fir and that cedar, you just have a big gap with no trees in it, which for timber, it's not ideal. And this is kind of inverse where it's timber production, it's ideal. We have these multiple age classes, but it's relatively dense. And so if a fire came in, it would probably have high rates of mortality and probably pretty intense fire behavior. So moving forward, I quickly want to touch on prescribed fire and some like economic considerations. Prescribed fire, I think, is a really awesome tool. It's the only tool that can actually remove surface fuels. Like logging can't do that, mastication can't do that. You're just rearranging fuel. You can also use it to remove ladder fuels and potentially thin. And it, over time, it'll boost resiliency, increase the bark thickness, and whatnot. But there's inherent risk with it, especially from a timber side, with uneven age structure where you want that continual regeneration coming in. So we're potentially cutting out our regeneration. And they can also, affect our crop trees. And then there's just the inherent risk of escape, and that I know that risk is very, very low, but the opportunity cost, if it escapes, is really high. And so there's just a risk that landowners have to deal with. And then I want to talk about economics. So to make uneven age dense structures more resilient, we need to reduce general density. And so that generally means more intensive harvest. And why a lot of land, especially small landowners, like uneven age selection is because it's a pretty constant cash flow of income. You're going to take generally the same amount of wood out every decade or 5 years or 20 years. And so it's a really good, even investment, right? And so when we want to make things more resilient, we're going to have to probably cut them harder, and then you got to wait longer. And so there's also just that dry spell of waiting for that cash flow, but there's also just kind of inherent risk just because the current climatic conditions, and you don't know if your neighbor's trying to do the same thing as you, so there's risk of still drought and fire impacting you. And so ways to mitigate that is doing non-commercial treatments. And it's kind of touched on that's what everyone's working on around here, right? So it's CVIT programs and with RCD and all different programs. Another way to mitigate that cash flow is conservation easements, and I think there's an increasing interest by the general public of supporting more resilient forests. And then I just want to quickly touch on carbon markets. Currently, the model that is used, it's grow more biomass to sequester than heat. Sequester as much carbon off to the side to mitigate for other impacts. But as you can see, if we're trying to make things more resilient, we need to at least, remove biomass. And so hopefully, I hope, especially with the CARB market, ARB market, I hope that eventually it will give more value to resilient carbon that can handle different disturbances. And I think that will really help small landowners in the long run. So in summary, I hope that my point is that it's really hard to balance resiliency with timber production. And it's not that they can't go hand in hand, but we're still figuring it out. And then, but we need to figure out, because we need to have, economic outlets for private timberlands. We like to have people here and we like to jobs. But we also need to be able to live here, you know, we need to have clean water and healthy forests to be here. So, and if this topic really interests you, I really suggest this book, Ecological Culture Systems. There's a great chapter in it by Rob York, and there's some other chapters on really similar forests that we see around here. Yeah, that's all I got.
Thank you. I don't know if you can speak to this question, but is Hearst Forest looking into alternative economic models to bring in resources to sustain our forests? Circular economics in which there may be other products that they could co-produce with timber?
Nothing beyond carbon and conservation uses currently, but I know when looking in carbon markets, I noticed in the voluntary market, there are these markets that are starting to come out that like they'll pay you values for how much different like biodiversity they can measure on your property. So that's something that's starting to emerge, but it's all involuntary, so it's not very consistent. Beyond that, we don't do any other products really.
The problem with carbon credits, it's really in service of the technocratic economy.
Yeah.
And there are cultural economies that exist in this area that could be provided access to private lands in order to regenerate the economy in a more ecological fashion.
Definitely. That's the issue with private is it's, you know, it's still a private landowner and, you know, their willingness to allow other folks to utilize those different aspects, you know, the owner might not agree with that product, that, you know, economic outcome. That's what I've seen to start the different landowners I worked for.
I'm curious, like, what could you describe like the current industry thinking on management of that youngest age cohort that you get? Like you showed that picture of the forest, there's a stand that was thin from below and had no regenerative. So, but on the other side of that coin, you see those really the thickets of it, and just the thought on managing that for the future, so you don't get the dog hair thick stand in 30 years.
Yeah, and that's something I think I've worked on a lot on is just you gotta get folks willing to have that pretty low return initial entry. And you know, that's what it helps when you actually have like a biomass market around you but the main thing is just getting people gotta be willing to like not make money on something. And it's hard to incentivize landowners to do that. Does that answer?
I mean, just in terms of like tools and techniques, does it tend to be like slow-paced mastication or hand thinning?
On the industrial side, we primarily focus on mastication. A lot of mastication and just get some kind of timber harvest to just get disturbance in there. Any other type of treatments is usually utilizing different grants, like using BTP and using help RCD help us and whatnot. It's subsidized, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you.
You call.